Welcome to The World This Week with me, Gavin Lee. Every week assessing the biggest global events of the past 7 days in 45 minutes alongside a panel of distinguished international correspondents. Our podcast version of the show has now climbed up the Millennium Podcast World's Top 100 to number 13 this week, so thank you so much for listening as well. In a week of movable ultimatums set by President Trump to obliterate Iran's power plants, a deadline that was set initially at Monday at midnight, then extended by 5 days on account of, quote, very productive conversations, then to 10 days with Trump claiming talks are ongoing and, quote, going very well. Tehran claimed suggestions of negotiations were fake news, and the US talk of de-escalation was a front designed to buy time for a ground invasion with an amphibious force of US Marines heading from the Far East to the Persian Gulf. Washington presented a 15-point plan to end the conflict. Iran set out its own 5 conditions, reportedly relayed via Pakistan. But assassinations of the regime have continued. So too, Iran's de facto chokehold on the Strait of Hormuz, with both sides using the media to mock the other.
They are begging to make a deal, not me. They're begging to make a deal.
Fired. You are familiar with this sentence. Thank you for your attention to this matter.
It's been a week of intensified Israeli airstrikes and ground operations too in the south of Lebanon, with IDF blowing up bridges along the Litani River, which bisects the south of the country and meets the Mediterranean Sea. For what end? Israel says it's creating a defensive buffer zone against Iranian-backed Hezbollah fighters attacking northern Israeli towns. Lebanon's president says it's a violation of sovereignty, which cuts off civilians from dozens of towns and villages from the rest of the country. Nationwide, 1 in 5 people are reported to have fled their homes, and the UN warns of the risk of a Gaza-style siege in the south.
Hezbollah must stop launching attacks into Israel, and Israel must stop its military operations and strikes in Lebanon, which are hitting civilians the hardest. The Gaza model must not be replicated in Lebanon.
It's been a week where millions of travellers at US airports felt the effects of a partial government shutdown. Tens of thousands of transport security staff haven't been paid for more than a month, and the effect is sporadic chaos, snaking lines at airport gates and the longest wait times on record. There's been political deadlock since February, with Democrats blocking full funding for Homeland Security because of disputes over immigration and customs reforms that Republicans want. President Trump's solution? Send in the ICE agents to airports, raising questions for the US border czar, Tom Homan, over how useful that would be.
ICE isn't trained on x-rays and look at x-rays, see if there's, is something dangerous in that luggage. Well, no kidding, and we're not going to be doing that.
It's been a week of elections in Europe. In Denmark, political drama fit for an episode of Borgen as the Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, resigned for a second time in her career after her decision to call a snap election failed to pay off at the polls. Aiming for the so-called Greenland bounce after holding firm against US pressure in January, the result was that her centre-left party lost seats and her coalition lost its majority. The Social Democrats' worst result since 1903.
Vi har klaret corona.
We have managed the pandemic. We have had to deal with war. We've been threatened by the American president. And in these almost 7 years, we have gone down 4%. I think that's okay.
It's been election week in Slovenia too, and a fragmented result from a contest framed as the Liberals against the Populists, the party of the current pro-EU Prime Minister, Robert Golob, against the former leader, Janez Janša, who denied accusations that he hired a private investigator to dig for dirt on his rival. But Mr Golob ended up winning by the narrowest of margins. Coalition building begins. And here in France, all of the main parties seem to claim partial victories after municipal elections. Easy to do, with 35,000 seats up for grabs. The French left took the 3 biggest cities, Lyon, Marseille and in Paris, where the new mayor, socialist Emmanuel Grégoire, took a victory lap around the capital with a rental bike with supporters, while the far right failed in winning its targets in the south, but exponentially built on its voter base. And the party leader, Jordan Bardella, still tops the latest polls for the presidential election next year. Let's meet our panel tonight. Viv Walt is with us, journalist, renowned Paris correspondent for Time and Fortune. Hello, Vivienne. Great to have you here, as always. You've been working on a story or looking at arms issues in the shadow of this war.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, the Stockholm Institute of Peace Research, I think that's their full name, SIPRI, as it's commonly known, puts out a big database of arms transfers, as they call them, sales and purchases globally every year. It just came out. Obviously, it was done before the war, but some very, very interesting points. within it. And speaking to them when the report came out, they told me that among the things that seems kind of clear is that this war in Iran is burning through weapons stocks at quite an alarming rate. Hard to believe that there are not enough weapons in this world, but indeed there might not be. President Trump's talks as if the Iran war can go on indefinitely, militarily wise, but in fact that might really not be the case, especially when you're shooting, $1 million missiles at little drones that cost 40,000 each or something. So it's a real kind of asymmetry. It takes years to replenish supplies. The Gulf states have been very dependent on American weaponry, and they're now scrambling to diversify. So there's a lot of issues at stake.
It is. We'll come on to that's very relevant because as the US continues its war, it is weakening its own stocks, watched on by China. The old adage goes, never interrupt your enemy when it's making a mistake. We're going to get onto that exact area as well. Great that you're here with us, Viv. Let's move on. Let's introduce Emma Kate Simmons, the Paris-based editor of Frank Tireur magazine, writer of Conspiracy Watch and columnist at The New World. Evening, Emma Kate. Great to have you back with us as well. I want to get your take on something that's been framed by some analysts as social media's big tobacco moment this week. This is 2 court verdicts ruling against Meta, who are in charge of Facebook and Instagram, one against Google, who own YouTube. This is an LA lawsuit, the jury ruling that they've been, quote, negligibly designing addictive social media, in this case causing harm to the young plaintiff, and it's 2 features in particular, autoplay and infinite scroll. And my sense is whether you see this having a potential ripple effect further and wider.
Yes, absolutely. It's being correctly compared to the moment in the late 1990s when big tobacco was actually called to account in huge court cases, defeats in the judicial system in the United States, and forced to pay out those who had actually, been, victims of passive smoking and who died because of tobacco addiction. But there's these 2 cases, the one in California, but also in New Mexico, with a $375 million fine attached to it. And the 2 of them look at, on the one hand, the deliberate addiction that was forced onto children, basically, minors, with the full knowledge of these platforms. And on the other hand, the fact that basically Meta and other platforms are operating as a kind of sex trafficking platform with full knowledge of the owners. And so for Mark Zuckerberg and for all the CEOs of these big social media companies, it really is, as they're saying in the United States, karma. The karma is coming, and this is the first of some bellwether cases, but there's going to be many more, and not just in the United States. It's at a pivotal moment. It's come too late, but finally, after decades of this going on and children dying, thousands of children have died because of either being subject to predation or because they suicided because of harassment.
And as you know from your home country, Australia putting a ban in this week, a ban in Austria for under 14s as well. And it gets to the point that previous cases looked at apps that were being used. This was about the framework that it's being used in this infinite scroll. Emma Kate, as always, I'm looking forward to hearing your analysis tonight. Let's bring in our next correspondent, the independent journalist, reporter, commentator Josephine McKenna, who's been covering Italy, based in Rome, for more than 2 decades. Welcome to the programme. Welcome to The World This Week, Josephine. I mentioned elections in parts of Europe. Let's talk about this referendum in Italy this week. Called by Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. She lost, and referendums can be particularly politically dangerous territory for Italian leaders.
That's right. And particularly this sent shockwaves through Italy, through the Italian government. This was a big risk for Giorgia Meloni, and she lost this referendum by 54 to 46. But what was really significant here was we saw an incredible turnout of young voters, the under 30s, turned out in waves, and they said, we don't like what you're trying to do with judicial reform, don't touch our constitution, and by the way, we're not so happy with your cosy relationship with US President Donald Trump either. So we're seeing some pushback now. She got a fright, her coalition got a fright, and she's taken serious action straight away to reassert herself. She's gotten rid of 4 senior people in her government this week. The Tourism Minister, Daniela Santanchè, who was under investigation for fraud. Another minister, an Undersecretary in the Justice Ministry, who had alleged links to mafia, a business dealing. So she took too long to take action. She's taken strong action this week, and now we're waiting to see what happens next. She's looking for an election early in 2027. Will we see her go early to the polls? We'll have to wait and see. But I think she's very nervous about taking any further action to go back to the voters while this war is continuing in the Middle East.
This is very interesting. There are critics suggesting this week the Maloney bubble, as it were, has burst. He's lost from momentum as a result. You've talked about actually areas of perhaps she's looked to move responsibility. But let me ask you this, because you go back a few years to 2022. She's taken centre stage in European politics now, but she was looked at with kind of on the verge, with suspicion. And I listened to her one-time mentor about this. This is the politician Fabio Rampelli, who said she has the ability, how she's got to the centre, to disarm those around her, to make her laugh. He said it's a Roman trait, la battuta pronta, the ability to be quick-witted, to reply with a comeback. Is he right? And will she bounce back?
Well, I think what this has unleashed is really internal conflict within her own coalition, and that's what's interesting. She's going to have a few more issues, and incidentally, as part of this, the children of the late Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi are now getting involved. They're, of course, running the media empire and the financial empire that he left behind. He was a billionaire businessman, and they're flexing their muscles and trying to influence where she goes with her political policies. So I think we're going to see some shake-up, not only within the coalition, but within the electorate. She needs to demonstrate that she's serious about cost of living issues, creating jobs, health and education. People are looking to her for a different kind of leadership, I think.
That's very interesting. So actually looking, it's the base inside. Is there a comparison with the US, the MAGA movement, the MIGA movement in Italy?
I think it's a little bit different. I think it is a lot different in Italy. But what needs to be emphasised is the left is in disarray. The centre-left really needs to get its act together and create a viable coalition before the next election, whenever that will be.
Josephine, brilliant to have you with us tonight as well. Let's move from talk of Italy. Let's talk to Peter Apps, who is in London tonight. Peter, you will know from coming on the programme last time, global affairs columnist and commentator for Reuters, the author of The Next World War, The New Age of Global Conflict and the Fight to Stop It. It's brilliant to have you amongst us tonight, Peter. I also must say you will have another book that is particularly prescient tonight, Deterring Armageddon, a biography of NATO. Thanks for being back with us. The last time, you may remember we spoke, the US had captured Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela and threatened to take Greenland, arguably then comparatively calm to global events right now.
Yeah, I mean, when you describe me as the author of The Next World War, I'm not totally sure that's a reputation that one wants to necessarily get this year. To make it very clear, the book is about the next World War and the fight to stop it. But it has got a lot more complicated. And what we're now seeing in the Middle East, we just saw that item on Ukraine throwing its arms around Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states. I mean, take a moment to consider what that means. That's the most vulnerable country in Europe, the country that is being attacked by Russia, suddenly turning itself into the ally of first resort for a bunch of Gulf states that actually really dislike each other. So the Saudis and the Emiratis, really difficult relationship. They were not quite on the brink of war, but certainly really complicated. And all of that's going on. Those arms transfers that one of the other panelists was talking about. The Americans getting through quite a lot of weaponry. According to a piece that Reuters just ran, not my reporting, but one of my colleagues, the Iranians have got through about a third of their weapons stock so far, either destroyed or expended. So that means if it's a 4-week war, it could go up to about 12 weeks. The Americans could probably last a bit longer than that. But of course, they want to keep their weapons back for a war against China if that ever happens. So people are making lots of kind of trading weapons for time for weapons, money for anything. And Zelensky is now the friend everyone wants in the Middle East, which is a pretty stunning development if you think back to February 2022, which is only 4 years ago.
It is incredible, actually. We will talk about that, the quid pro quo going on there, particularly with Saudi Arabia. Do you know, Peter, when we're about to start the programme and I mentioned your book, Josephine said to me, can I ask, are we now in World War III? And I've heard you say, you get asked it so much, you say, we're not in a world war, we're in a battle for the world.
Yeah, so I mean, the battle for the world is clearly on, right? Lots of countries sparring against each other. Countries like Turkey and the Philippines all have their own kind of agendas. I mean, I would say that it doesn't feel like it's a world war unless London is maybe sort of taking the same kind of strikes from intermediate range ballistic missiles that it was at the end of the last World War. So not nuclear missiles, but we've moved out of this world that we were in for most of that history of NATO, so the first Cold War, where we assumed a nuclear war would be how World War started. Now, if somewhere like London or Paris was attacked, we assume it would be something like the Russians or Iranians firing conventional ballistic missiles, probably not very accurate ballistic missiles, but also maybe some of those drones that we saw in Dubai and Tehran taking out maybe key ministers. Maybe someone like the Elysee Palace would come under attack. That is a really different world because neither Paris nor London have the kind of air defenses to deal with that sort of thing. That's one of the reasons why the Ukrainians are selling their stuff so quickly to the Gulf states. But we're in this situation where the technology is changing, air defenses are changing. I talked to one air defense manufacturer that no one's really heard of this week, who are looking at having a whole bunch of stuff ready for maybe 28 or 2029, but very little ready so far this year. So there's really a remarkable amount of stuff going on. The Next World War, my last book, sums up essentially 2024 and 2025. 2026 already feels like a book and a half, and we're only in March, and there's still a lot more to go before we get even halfway through the year.
I will read it, Peter. It is a pleasure to have you with us as well tonight. Let's begin at the White House, where 10 o'clock Thursday morning, the Trump administration held its first wartime cabinet meeting for the cameras, rolling for over an hour as the president held court, inviting his secretaries to speak of their successes. Familiar rhetoric to begin. Iran's Navy destroyed. Air Force wiped out 90% of their missile launchers and missiles destroyed. He claimed, essentially, the US is executing the war as imagined and on schedule, with the plan being for operations to last between 4 and 6 weeks, he said. The deadline for the ultimatum of, quote, obliterating Iranian power plants was originally set for last Monday, then moved to this weekend, now paused for 10 days because Iran is begging for more time to talk, he claimed, suggesting Tehran's request for a 7-day extension. Well, he gave them, he said, a 10-day extension because the regime offered, quote, a gift to Washington, allowing several oil tankers to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. It was Iran's negotiators proving they were who they said they were, claimed President Trump. Lousy fighters, he said, but great negotiators. He also took aim at his allies. NATO countries were a disappointment. Where was the support, he asked? And all the while, almost 5,000 US Marines are en route to the Persian Gulf, if not already there. The Wall Street Journal reporting that President Trump is said to be thinking about sending an additional 10,000 troops to the region as US and Israeli jets continue to bomb sites in Iran, continuing their assassinations, including of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard commander, said to be in charge of attacks on the shipping in the Straits of Hormuz. Tehran still striking back against Israel and in the Gulf. Viv, we stop with you. Information inside Iran we know is very difficult still. It's the longest internet suppression since the regime took power. What is your assessment of this week's developments?
You know, what strikes me so much about President Trump and his prickly sort of vengeful behavior, certainly at yesterday's cabinet meeting, is that he still behaves as if he can control the whole thing. Like he has a way, we're going to fight this amount of time, and honestly, this is a war much, much more than Venezuela or any other foreign adventures he's gotten himself into in the last 15 months. This is a war that has totally slipped out of his control. And it is also an adversary that has spent literally decades planning blow by blow for this very moment. And so he's clearly out of his depth, which is an astonishing thing to say for the US president. But I think for anyone looking at it, and you don't need to be in the Middle East to look at it from far, it appears as if they really at this point are floundering.
A point of floundering, Emma Kate. We know and we hear from the Trump administration sources saying Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are involved again in more diplomacy talks in a crisis. This time talks said to be happening, with Pakistan being a key conduit in playing the messenger. Talks, credible reports suggesting there may be indirect face-to-face talks in the same room or building perhaps in Pakistan in the coming days. We know we have a 15-point US plan. We have a 5-point Iranian framework. There appears to be dialogue, there appears to be plans, some movement.
Well, there appears to be dialogue. It's denied evidently by the regime in Iran. I wouldn't put much faith or stock in what Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are up to. They're always rolled out at these points, family friend, literally son-in-law and golfing buddy, to do Trump's bidding. But I mean, what's significant is what's already been pointed out. I mean, today at the G7 outside of Paris, apparently Marco Rubio briefed other member states there and said that the war that he thinks will probably last between at least 2 and 4 weeks, and that the US will not abandon until it's achieved its objectives. Now, whether or not those objectives appear to be changing, whether they say Trump, whether he says it's a war or a conflict, seems to change every other day, or he's tiring of it, this report seems to have credibility about this thinking to perhaps send in 10,000 ground troops, because even The Economist, extremely harsh today, published a story saying advantage Iran. They say the US has achieved nothing despite the early victory of taking out the Ayatollah Khamenei and many of the leadership. They say that their analysis is that the regime is even stronger than it was before. Paradoxically, because the guardians of the revolution have been strengthened, and with the internet ban and the repression, there's not a word being heard anymore, or very little, from the former protesters who were massacred in January, ethnic minorities. So it's extremely worrying, and also US bases being attacked all around the region, along with British, French. I mean, it's chaotic. He can't control it, it would appear.
I'll try and quickly summarise these plans. It's like trying to summarise Proust right now for the 15 points for the US. So the US wants a shutdown of key nuclear plants, to stop uranium enrichment entirely, to allow nuclear inspectors to come in, to limit ballistic missile development, and to end Iran's support for proxies in the region, as well as opening the Straits of Hormuz. In exchange, the US will give sanctions relief and support for Iran's civilian nuclear power system. Iran, meanwhile, wants war reparations, a binding agreement from the US and Israel never to attack again in future. Full stop. Iran to be recognised as having sovereign control of the Strait of Hormuz, and for Israel to end its other ongoing wars. Peter, what are you making of those seemingly maximalist plans and the chances for somehow meeting in the middle?
No one's going to get that. I mean, if the UK was to ask for total sovereign control of the English Channel, we'd have to take back Calais, and we spent 500 years trying to do that in the Middle Ages and it didn't work. So they're deliberately maximalist, as you said. I mean, I think, that's quite an interesting comment from Rubio. Another 4 weeks. That presumably would bring the Iranians down to only a third of the missile stocks they had at the beginning of the war. That would give them the ability to do this again at a time of their choosing, but for not as long. That would actually meet the basic US war aims of degrading Iran enough so that they couldn't close the Straits of Hormuz again. So you're beginning to see what's really going on here. The US definitely won't have used up 2/3 of its entire weapon stocks in another 4 weeks, because obviously the US arsenals are much, much deeper. But on the other hand, they don't really want to lose up anything of something that they might have to take on China with at a future point. The other interesting stuff you've seen going on today is a talk about it's not quite clear what this means, but certainly fewer US weapon stocks going to Ukraine. Now, the fact that the Ukrainians believe they have enough weaponry and air defences to spare to give to the Gulf suggests that's maybe not as big a deal as it might have been. If Zelensky was really worried about his weapon stocks, then he wouldn't be giving them away in the Middle East. And that tells you how fast everything is changing, because actually all of those old weapons, and by which I mean pre-2022 weapons, are now very, very expensive. They cost multi-millions to fire, and quite a lot of that capability has now been replicated in Ukraine, and by Russia, in fact, much more cheaply. And that is something that everyone should sort of sit down and think about for a second, because it means it's a bit like what you might call the dreadnought moment. So the dreadnought was the big ironclad battleship launched by Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, sort of in about just over 5 years before the First World War, that was regarded as making all other ships irrelevant. And in fact was irrelevant herself by the launch of the First World War. So instead of it being one big ship, what we're seeing is lots of quite cheap weapons systems, and that means that no one is quite where they thought they were. And that includes the People's Republic of China, because we know that Xi Jinping has fired all his generals, and it appears to be that one of the reasons for that is corruption, which is actually because quite a lot of those weapons don't work as advertised. And that brings us to all manner of quite complicated questions about what it will take to reopen Hormuz, because it means the Iranians will have to stop trying to close it. And I think there are about 3 ways in which that could happen. The first is that they reach a deal with the Americans. The second is that the Americans reach a deal with somebody else, either the Gulf states or maybe the UN, to reopen the Straits of Hormuz, and the Iranians agree not to shoot at those people. And that is interesting because the only navy I can think of that could do that is the Chinese Navy, because they buy energy from Iran, and therefore if the Chinese were to put a force in Hormuz under UN backing, in other words, be agreed to by the Americans, then possibly you could then have a bunch of nations, probably not the US, but including, say, the Chinese and the Europeans, escorting ships through Hormuz, not having to fight anybody because the Iranians decide not to shoot at them. And that would be a very interesting moment. And it is worth remembering that Xi Jinping and Trump are supposed to meet at some point, and they're delayed by about a month. So I think when Rubio says this might have another month to go, that means that they think that they're inflicting useful damage on Iran, and also presume that the Israelis think they're inflicting useful damage on Lebanon, and we've just seen that is causing a humanitarian catastrophe, or at least a humanitarian crisis. Everyone has fled, so very few people are being killed because they've fled the area, but people's lives are being wrecked. The Israelis also presumably feel they have a bunch of things that they're achieving over that time. But you're hearing pretty much everyone beginning to signal that they don't want to be doing this by the middle of the year. So, this war started in February, we're now coming through March. No one seems to want to be doing this in May. And that either they won't be able to control this and it will continue, or you will start to see things move back to a more sort of usual state of play. And that, of course, when all the other confrontations, Ukraine, China, Taiwan, all so forth, will come back to the fore. And that would be interesting because it tells us what war looks like now, or war can look like now. And it increases the chances that we'll see something like this happen maybe around the Taiwan Strait. The Indians fought the Pakistanis like this, don't forget, only last summer. So, this idea that you might suddenly see an exchange of missiles and so forth, suddenly it makes a small war in Europe feel more plausible. But all of these things are really difficult to control. And in the Middle East, they may just be controlled this time. 10,000 troops is not enough to invade Iran, certainly not enough to seize one side of the Straits of Hormuz, but it's enough to put pressure on people. And I think it's that use of pressure and lethal force that is really what tells us about the way the world is shifting. And just to say, yes, the US president looks out of his depth, but every US president has looked out of their depth so far this century, dealing with challenges so far. The last US president who didn't, I would say, was probably George Bush Sr. So, if Obama had been told by the Israelis that they were going to kill the Ayatollah, we would be in a hole that wouldn't look that different to this. It's very easy to blame Donald Trump, but actually, we could have ended up in a similar shaped hole under any of the previous presidents. You could imagine this happening to Clinton. You could imagine it happening to Bush Jr. You could definitely imagine it happening to Obama. And you could definitely imagine that happening to Biden.
You make a number of interesting points, and I do want to get onto some of them shortly, because actually you also talk about where we'll go, the broadening out of this, the superpower contest with China, Beijing watching Washington, Washington watching Beijing. Before we do, I want to come to you, Josephine, because what Peter was talking about, how easy it is to be drawn in, and it's relevant. When we watched President Trump yesterday explaining his deep dissatisfaction with NATO, with his allies in Europe, talking about they weren't there at the start of the war. Now they say they'll be there, but when the war's over. This is about, he feels that Europe, he feels NATO has deeply let the US down.
Yes, but what do you expect? If you bully NATO at the beginning, we're talking about Greenland, we're talking about other issues that have come up, how can you expect the European countries and the members of NATO to step up when the US says, we'd really like you to get involved now? I think there's been a lot of confusion among the NATO members about where to go with this, but I'm wondering if now we're seeing a little bit more backbone from the European countries, particularly these leaders of Germany, France and Great Britain, coming together, Italy less so, but those three emerging as very strong players now and driving a bit more of the agenda. My question is NATO, is the US membership of NATO now dead? Because it looks to me like the US relationship with the European partners is still in disarray.
But there seems to have been a question since 2017 onwards, from President Trump's been in power, and he hasn't at any point said, I'm removing myself and the US from it. And yet he called it, once again, a paper tiger. He said, I've said as much for 25 years, it's a paper tiger. But then you are part of that paper tiger right now. Emma Kate, it's an interesting point. And just on Josephine's point about the E3, about Germany, the UK, France, it's probably worth saying there's a kind of special place in hell right now, it seems, for Keir Starmer in President Trump's mind. He retweeted a Saturday Night Live skit where he was kind of talking, saying, I'm out of my depth, Lammy, to David Lammy, suggesting that he would rather hide away from the consequences. What are you making of that breakup?
I think it's a little bit more complex than Trump thought that this was only a humiliation for Starmer, when in fact the fact that Starmer stands up to Trump but also is in between, because he has to, obviously, he's not for the war, but if British interests are threatened, and they have been, he's changed his position. And so I think Trump loves to think, and it's very upsetting to hear him humiliate every other day. He's really picking on Starmer at the moment. But obviously earlier in the year it was Greenland. He was threatening a military invasion against a NATO ally. He's been threatening the French. Obviously, all of these allies are just so exhausted by the threats and the actual execution of those threats, including when it comes to tariffs. He's constantly threatening economic kind of sanctions to try and push Europe to do what he wants. And you're absolutely right. Why should, after all of this abuse, the Europeans and the NATO allies suddenly, salute to attention? So he needs to take a different tack, but I'm not sure that's in him. But he's facing his own problem domestically. He's got his highest disapproval rating ever, 59%. The war is not popular. There's a slice of MAGA that don't like it. But the real issue, and this is where it becomes a global conflict, is economic. Inflation. And the price of oil, I think, was up at $111 a barrel, wasn't it, today?
Gas has gone up by practically $1 at the petrol pumps.
Yes. And then, so the global economy is absolutely in trouble. The markets, also the stock markets, are suffering. There's been, shares are dropping in value. So this is all going to be a worry for Donald Trump. It's like a perfect storm. And everyone's affected in rich countries, but especially in developing and middle-income countries.
But as a lame duck president, you still have to ask yourself, does he really care? Is he there just to enrich himself before he leaves office?
Not that lame duck.
Until
Not
November.
right now.
In the sense that there are midterm elections this year. If he loses
he's
them,
not really showing a lot of regard for those people who are coming up for election, is he?
No, but if the Republicans face real defeat this November, it could absolutely put a brake on anything he wants to do. It could ultimately land him in prison if, feasibly. So I don't think he's completely disregarded. I think the real problem is that European countries, or major countries, let's say G7 countries, not just Europe, are in a really tight spot. This is a war that they had nothing to do with. They were never consulted with. Their populations hate the idea. So, defending it in any way is political suicide. On the other hand, they have to find a way to reopen the Strait of Hormuz because it's their economies that are up against the wall. So I think it's really hard. And I think the other real problem that they're facing is they can say, well, we will only do it defensively. We'll only do it once there's a ceasefire in place. But there's no real clear end date to this war. So what if we have a ceasefire, everything's fine, and then the Iranians activate the Houthis and, they begin attacking every ship that goes through the Red Sea. And don't forget, it's not just oil. We're talking fertilizer. We're talking massive amounts of fiber optic cables that go under both the Strait of Hormuz
we're also talking
and
pharmaceuticals.
Peter.
We're also talking pharmaceuticals. So most of the world's pharmaceuticals come from India in terms of precursor chemicals. You're going to start to see really quite catastrophic shortages of things like cancer drugs, probably around the 2-3 month mark, which is one of the reasons why Rubio is very deliberately signaling to the Iranians it's not going to run that long. Because don't forget, Donald Trump has midterm elections, but those midterm elections are in November. And it's fairly clear that the US approach is that they want this well over by then and well in the past. So, I think this is very much a first half of 2026 story. And both the Iranians and the Americans are strongly incentivized to move past that in the second half of the year. Because I think the financial markets are important. But again, what Trump wants is to make sure that all of those US financial markets are higher in November than they were now. And secondly, quite a lot of people around him seem to be trading some of these moves, so that it's fairly clear that some people are trading markets in advance of big developments happening. So I think there is a lot going on, and there's a lot at stake. Yeah. But I think everyone is trying to dance towards a situation where all the powerful people benefit by getting into just the right place at the end of this, where the Iranians, particularly the IRGC, are back running Iran. the MAGA crowd are back in the in a decently high saddle position when they come into the midterms. And you're right, Keir Starmer is in a horrific position because he doesn't have elections until 2029. So he's being beaten up left, right, and centre. But actually, the one thing he's done that's popular in the UK is not diving into this.
Yes.
Because actually, the one thing the British people dislike is people like David Cameron and Tony Blair getting into expensive wars, not just that kill British service personnel, but also kill a very large number of people in the countries where those conflicts take place, most recently being Libya.
Peter, there's a couple of thoughts. Emma Kate mentioned something about the exhaustion of European allies just dealing with President Trump. And it's also worth the very real fact of how long, and you've pointed to it, Vivian pointed to it, the stockpiles, ammunition, troops. The Israeli opposition leader Yair Lapid this week saying that the Israeli military is now stretched to breaking point. So you have so many wars on so many fronts for Israel, that becomes a factor. I also want you to do something that we don't always get to do, but we can with you. Take us above the Kármán line. Take us 100 kilometres above sea level to where the Earth's atmosphere meets outer space, because this is the role of US Space Command, satellites, AI, critical for the operations in this conflict.
Yeah, so I mean, amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics, but real insiders talk career track. And no one is taking a long-term career view like US Space Command, because US Space Command have made a grab for all of the territory above the Kármán line, so everything above low Earth orbit. And for the United States, that is their responsibility forever. It goes out to infinity. Now, what that really means, of course, is Earth orbit at the moment, because that means satellites, lots of things like SpaceX owns a very large amount of those satellites for Starlink. But those satellites are looking down. Some of them are probably already being jammed. You've got Chinese with the space station. You've got Artemis 2, so the big moon rocket just being refueled in Cape Canaveral to go to the moon, trying to get American astronauts back around the moon. They're not going to land, but they're going to go around the moon to show US dominance, and the Chinese not far behind. So the Chinese want to get to the moon with people by 2030, and they want to have a drone base there beforehand, possibly as soon as 2028. And the Americans are fighting the same battle with a lot of stuff that doesn't work very well, because we have this rather awkward moment where lots of the big technology, whether that is tanks or missiles, are very hard to make, whether it's a Tomahawk cruise missile or a US aircraft carrier or a British aircraft carrier that Trump was rather patronizing about today, and not necessarily incorrectly. They are a lot less capable than US aircraft carriers, despite being about the same size. All of these big bits of kit are turning out to be incredibly expensive, and jogging in on the inside, you can see, Volodymyr Zelensky, but there are problems with fighting a war forever with your entire population. Zelensky is running out of soldiers, Netanyahu is running out of soldiers, and we're really entering what, something that you could compare to the last great Viking age. You have fighting seasons. You can call up your army for a certain period of time, but not forever. And, so the Poles, for example, are racing to try and catch up with this by training everyone who they can this year. The last point, I think, is about the Middle East, which I think is really interesting. The Americans have dominated the Middle East since the end of World War II, and they no longer wish to. They would like the Europeans to take over the Middle East, as in the dominant outside military player, and they believe that there's a case for that because the Middle East supplies European energy in a way that it doesn't supply American energy anymore. Clearly, the Europeans believe they have a Russia problem, and they don't believe they have the capability to do the Middle East as well. Although suddenly, again, the Ukrainians sprinting in on the inside track, suddenly throwing a European arm around the Middle East, despite being the country no one expected to do so. But you're seeing, what does that look like? Is there a US, Chinese, European, Saudi, Emirati, Qatari, Iranian, Israeli deal to be done about how the Middle East is run going forwards? Because the truth is, these wars only ever pause for a bit. This is the Persians, this is the Israelites, it's the Palestinians, it's the Arabs, it's the Assyrians. None of these wars have ever ended permanently. The Israelites were kicked out of the Middle East into Europe for 2,000 years and genocided in the Second World War, and they're still back, and they still haven't gone away. And they're not going to. They're signaling that very clearly. And if they're not going to, the Iranians sure as hell aren't. So, therefore you end up with, it is about managing these great power dynamics on a multi-decade, multi-century level. And that is really what's going on here. And Donald Trump is neither the best nor worst person to find himself caught in the middle of this dynamic ever. There were worse Roman emperors than this, there were worse British kings than this, and Keir Starmer is discovering the slight awkwardness of being a British Prime Minister at the least powerful point in British history in probably about 500 years.
Well, yes, this is fascinating. You've taken us from the Carmen line back in history. We will go back to power politics next to Budapest Saturday morning in the midst of Hungary's election campaign, where Europe's longest-serving Prime Minister Viktor Orbán was playing host to dozens of leaders from right-wing parties from around the world to help boost his re-election chances. It included a video endorsement from President Trump. But that morning's Washington Post contained two explosive allegations that the Kremlin had suggested planning a fake assassination attempt on Viktor Orbán to boost his chances in the election. Denied by Viktor Orbán, denied by the Kremlin. The Washington Post cited a Russian intelligence report seen by European intel agencies. The second allegation was that the Foreign Minister, Peter Szijjártó, had made regular phone calls during breaks at EU meetings to provide his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, with, quote, live reports on what's being discussed and to talk about possible solutions, citing a European security official who, quote, said, every single EU meeting for years has basically had Moscow behind the table. By Monday, the opposition leader and election frontrunner, Peter Magyar, was calling for an investigation accusing the ruling party of possible treason.
Én azzal egyeztetek a külügyminiszteri tanácsok előtt. Before and after the foreign ministers' councils, I coordinate about the decisions made there with those with whom consulting is important from Hungary's perspective.
Including Sergei Lavrov?
Well, of course, Russia is an important partner for Hungary.
He went on to say that he also called Turkey and US officials. He was asked whether his conversations with Sergei Lavrov were harming the interests of the EU.
How could they have been harmed? This is so frivolous.
Well, he's rejected accusations of violating security protocols at EU Foreign Affairs Council meetings. Emma Kate, you followed this story quite closely this week.
Yes, I mean, obviously the links between Viktor Orban's regime and Moscow are even deeper than we even realised. And I think, you know, when you look at the fact that this material, like basically leaking directly to the Kremlin from Europe, so there's at the heart of the European Union, there's a traitorous force that wants to sell out European ideals, the European economy, and the Ukrainians in the war. And I think, you know, Anne Applebaum, who wrote Autocracy, Inc., she was sharing about a story in the Atlantic about this upcoming election. And she says that Orban wants Hungarians to re-elect him, even though he's turned Hungary into the most corrupt and one of the poorest countries in the EU. And he's telling Hungarians to fear sabotage, thievery, or even a military attack from Ukraine. So all of the Soviet playbook, KGB playbook of perhaps staging an assassination attempt, apparently spying on and certainly intimidating journalists who have been revealing bravely all of this kind of betrayal of Hungary and Europe and giving of information to the Russians, and even worse. So I think, you know, we saw this gathering in Budapest earlier this week of the conservative CPAC, and Orban invited, but we had Marine Le Pen, Geert Wilders from the Netherlands, there was Javier Milei from Argentina. It was basically, you know, like a powwow of the extreme right international, but particularly European. And Marine Le Pen has clearly said she's on the side of Viktor Orban, and who has betrayed Ukraine and even blocked a loan that was supposed to go to Ukraine. So what is Europe going to do about that?
I want to go a minute to each of you before we end the programme, with Josephine, with Viv and for Peter, because what is Europe going to do about that? Josephine, this is quite a useful friend, possibly, that Moscow has in Europe right now.
Yeah, that's true. And I think the thing to watch in Italy is there are strong links between Orban and the Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, as well as the far-right leader, League leader, Matteo Salvini, who's also the Deputy Prime Minister. So as you said, there is this little forum that's weaseling its way through. And I'm curious to know what the EU will do to reassert itself. And I don't think it's a good look for Giorgia Meloni, for example, to continue this kind of relationship with Orban at this particular moment.
Well, Kaya Kallas, EU's Foreign Affairs Chief, says the EU is currently asking for clarity. The Viktor Orban team say there's nothing to say. This is just friendly briefs with other relations. There's nothing in terms of leaks. Peter, Emma Kate talked about the journalist Szabos Panyi, who has been charged with spying for Ukraine this week, having done a story about Hungarian officials allegedly transporting sums of money and valuables from Russia. I think there are big questions out there of press freedom in Hungary.
the case like that, I think it's fairly simple. Was he being paid by the Ukrainian government to write that? In which case, you probably crossed the boundary into treason, or was he doing it and perhaps had he got some help by friendly officials from a country briefing him, which is a more complicated kind of dynamic. He certainly wasn't extrajudicially killed, so that's a good sign, because actually that if we were going too much down the Russia adjacent route, then that's what would have happened instead. But yes, obviously questions of media freedom and pressure on journalists. But I think it's interesting that we're talking about maybe Viktor Orban running out of rope, because actually the real question is what happens in France next year and Germany 2 years after that. So in 2029, because if Putin was to lose Orban but to gain France and Germany, then that's that's not a win for the anti-Putin European pro-Ukrainian forces, even if Orban goes.
To that point on France, Viv, there is a quote from Bill Clinton that he is apparently said, attributed to him 26 years ago in the Gore versus Bush election, particularly apt this week. Quote, "I guess you could say the people have spoken and now we have to figure out what they said." Takes us to the end, the aftermath, the dust settling on the French elections, municipal elections, what it says about next year's presidential vote. What's your take?
I think it's very messy, and I think that French politics has a real problem, which is this total fragmentation. I think it was clear from this past week that the far right, and you could say this across Europe actually, has a certain ceiling. Yes, they've got these charismatic figures, Le Pen, Bardella, Orban. These are like real personalities, and as such, they draw enormous crowds. But they've always hit a ceiling. And as yet, we have yet to see it break through. Of course, Hungary, yes, far right, but it's a tiny country. And when you're talking about France, I frankly am still sceptical.
Viv, a nice place to end. Thank you all so much. That was a brilliant set of analysis and correspondent thoughts, giving us a unique insight from decades of on-the-ground experience and a passion for reporting that AI will never be able to replicate. In London, joined by Peter Apps, global affairs columnist and commentator for Reuters, author of, among other books, the incredibly prescient, pertinent The Next World War, The New Age of Global Conflict, and as Peter said, The Fight to Stop It, which I highly recommend. Thank you, Peter. In the studio with me, Vivian Waltz, who we just heard, Paris correspondent for Time and Fortune magazine. Thank you, Viv. Emma Kate Simmons, editor of Frank Tirot magazine, columnist for The New World. Thank you, Emma Kate. And thank you to Josephine McKenna, independent Rome-based correspondent covering all things Italian and beyond. Thank you too. We'll leave you for the trailer of the new HBO Harry Potter TV series. It's dropped this week, back on screen after 15 years, receiving, as everything does, a mixed reaction. Quote, "Looks a bit like the original, but colder," ran the headline of the Business Insider. "A bit too TV, lacks cinematic warmth," said fans to The Hollywood Reporter. But Games Radar reported fans like the tone and the new approach. J.K. Rowling has so far kept her powder dry. We will leave you with the trailer so you can judge for yourself. We wish you a magical weekend, and we'll see you in 7 days for the world next week.
Let's see who you are.
Are you really Harry Potter?